In this video, I thought I would talk about what we've covered in this course. We talked a little bit about some reversing tools. We talked about a couple debuggers. We talked about decompilers such as Boomerang and RecStudio. We talked about standard tools like Metasploit. We talked about fuzzing and different fuzzers that you had, network fuzzers and file fuzzers. We learned a little bit of assembly along the way. We looked at both 32 and 64-bit assembly as it applies to Windows and Linux. We also touched on the Mac system and how it differs a little bit when it comes to Linux. And we talked about ARM and how it's very different in terms of selectable endedness and all of those other issues, different registers and different calling conventions. We talked about how those differ from one system to the next and how you can use the calling convention and the stack to do exploits. And we covered a lot about stack buffer overflows. We went into great depth when we talked about 32 and 64-bit Windows and Linux. We also talked about OS X and how it's different. We talked about how some of these operating systems have stack protectors. And in all cases, we talked about exploit techniques. And even where there is some protection, there's still vulnerabilities. We also touched on the ARM and recall that the ARM was a little bit different because normally it didn't use the stack for passing parameters to functions. So you have to go about things a little bit differently there. We also talked about heap buffer overflows. We went into great depths on Windows and Linux again, and we showed you how you could exploit those heap buffer overflows and how Windows, Linux, and Mac all use different ways of keeping track of the heap and what's been allocated from it. So we talked about how the exploit techniques vary. We also touched on the ARM platform, and we talked about format string flaws. Now recall that these are not operating system dependent. There was, however, differences in protections. In particular, on Linux systems, typically you would be warned if you had a potential format string problem. And we went into some nice detail on how you could exploit those. We also talked about some miscellaneous vulnerabilities, things like overflowing sections, finding flaws in kernels. We also hit on Android applications. We talked about web vulnerabilities, both in programmer's code and in website implementation code. We talked about various injections in websites and databases. We also leveraged automation. We showed you how you could do things like using scripting to more easily discover vulnerabilities. And we also showed you how to script your exploits. We learned how to use and write shell code. So once again, we covered in depth 32-bit and 64-bit Windows and Linux. We also touched on ARM and Mac OS X. We introduced Metasploit, which is one of the most popular tools in the InfoSec industry. Showed you how you could create a module from an exploit script, and we showed you how you could encode shellcode in order to avoid detection. We talked about performing web exploits from within Metasploit, and we also performed some Android exploits and showed you how those work. Along the way, we learned a little bit about Python and Perl, some shell scripting, and various miscellaneous tips and tricks. So a natural question you ask yourself is, now what? Where do you go from here? Well, I have a couple of ideas. Here are some suggestions from me. You could dig a little bit deeper into your chosen specialization. Maybe you say, I want to specialize on Linux, or I want to specialize on a certain version of Windows, and I want to exploit vulnerabilities there. You can't go wrong by learning more about Python. Python is a very common scripting language that's used in our industry, and it's also very powerful, easy to learn. You might also consider taking a class on Metasploit. There's a lot to learn with Metasploit, very large and powerful tool. or learn a little bit more about 32 and or 64-bit assembly. We've just scratched the surface. We showed you how you could write some simple shell code. Maybe you want to do something beyond shell coding. Perhaps you would like to explore some more advanced features in Immunity Debugger. Python will help you because you can use Python within that debugger. Maybe you're new to Linux and you're a little bit unsure on how to use it. I would encourage you to install it and figure it out. Perhaps a course or a book would help as well. If you wanted to contact me, feel free. Some of the best ways to contact me are via Twitter at @ppolstra. You can also reach me via my website, philpolstra.com. Or if you see me at a conference, feel free to stop me and have a chat.